Hi, welcome back to 8-Bit Retro. In my last video, I was looking up game cart ROM sizes and how they were shown on all kinds of different game boxes. During my research, I was going through the different eras of machines and I came across something mildly interesting. Now, I realize that many of you already knew this, but I went 28 years without knowing this. Now, first of all, there are quite a few generations of consoles, each of them with their own Rockstar consoles within. So, allow me to share. But first, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that like button so I know when the turkey is done. There are 9 generations of consoles, so let's get started. The first generation, 1972 to 1980. During the first generation era, the inaugural wave of home consoles primarily consisted of dedicated systems featuring only 1 or 2 pre-installed games, offering minimal flexibility to modify gameplay elements. For instance, the Odyssey, despite being bundled with game cards, lacked programmed games. Instead, these cards served as jumpers to adjust circuitry pathways without enhancing the console's functionalities. Unlike subsequent console iterations, initial consoles were often produced in limited batches rather than as continuous product lines. Notable consoles of the era include a home Pong machine, Magnavox Odyssey, and the Coleco Telestar. The second generation, 1976 to 1992. The second generation era began around 1976 and was at the start of an upsurge of popularity for video game consoles. Notable platforms of the second generation include the Fairchild Channel F, Atari 2600, Odyssey 2, Intellivision, and ColecoVision. All of them were released in that order, and by the end of this era, there were 15 consoles on the market, which was the peak of the popularity of the video game consoles. This was also the era that the video game crash of 1983 happened due to an oversaturation of video games. That was a dark year for video game consoles and games. The future seemed uncertain. Until the third generation, 1983 to 2003. The third generation of video game consoles, commonly known as the 8-bit era, began in July 1983 with the Japanese release of 2 systems, Nintendo's Family Computer, also known as the Famicom, and Sega's SG-1000. The Famicom was released outside of Japan as the remodeled Nintendo Entertainment System, and the SG-1000 was named the Sega Master System. This was the era that I started in. My first machine I ever played was the Sega Master System. It was a beauty. The fourth generation, 1987 to 2004. The fourth generation of video game consoles, commonly known as the 16-bit era, began in October 1987 with the Japanese release of NEC Home Electronics PC Engine, which is known as the TurboGrafx 16 in North America. Although NEC introduced the first console during this period, sales were predominantly shaped by the fierce competition between Sega and Nintendo in most markets. This rivalry centered around Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. Cartridge-based handheld consoles started making their appearance during this time, such as the Nintendo Game Boy and Atari Lynx in 1989, and the Sega Game Gear and Turbo Express in 1990. CD-ROM-based add-ons started blipping on the radar at this time as well. This is what my childhood was all about. The 16-bit goodness and having arguments about which was better, Nintendo or Sega. What a time to be alive. The fifth generation, 1993 to 2006. The fifth generation era, commonly known as the 32-bit era, the 64-bit era, or the 3D era, began around October 1993 with the release of the Panasonic 3DO, Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and the Nintendo 64. The 3DO was a super expensive console with a launch price of $699 US, so it was very hard to get your hands on one. The Atari Jaguar was the world's first 64-bit console, but it fell short with consumers. The Sega Saturn was a pricey machine at launch, but not as bad as the 3DO, and it too fell short after the failure of the 32X add-on for the Sega Genesis, and the fact that they were released so close together. The PlayStation was a commercial success and was one of the best-selling consoles of that era, followed by the Nintendo 64. The handheld consoles included the redesigned Game Boy Color and the Virtual Boy, a 3D console that required you to sit at a table to play. The red screens and the awkward playing position always gave me a headache. But overall, a lot of good memories from this era. The 6th generation, 1998 to 2013. The 6th generation era, sometimes but not very often, referred to as the 128-bit era, began in November 1998. Consoles during this era include the Sega Dreamcast, Sony PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube, and Microsoft Xbox. During this time, these consoles were starting to utilize the internet and offer online play. They were also starting to make use of hard disks to save game data and updates. All these consoles made the move to CD-ROM storage, and Nintendo had to be a little different by using smaller format discs. The PlayStation 2 was the best-selling console during this era and of all time. No surprise there, that was a bitchin' machine. And the Game Boy continues to amaze with a full-color display called the Game Boy Advance. Now, let's move on to the 7th generation, 2005 to 2017. The 7th generation, which had no common alias or nickname, began in November 2005, starting with the release of the Xbox 360. This was then followed by the PlayStation 3 and the Nintendo year 1 year later. By this time, Sega had left the home console market and focused on being a publisher. High-definition movies and gaming made their debut in this era. The Wii was the best-selling console of this era. Handheld machines include the Nintendo DS and the PlayStation Portable, also known as the PSP. Next up, and still going today, is the 8th generation, 2012 to present. The 8th generation era began in 2012 with the release of the Wii U. Then came the Nintendo Switch, PS4, and Xbox One. Handheld consoles consisted of the Nintendo 3DS and the PS Vita. And finally, we arrive at the 9th generation, 2020 to now. Current consoles and hot gaming ticket items are the PS5 and the Xbox Series X or Series S. What is up with that naming convention for Xbox? Was 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 too hard? In this era, the handheld consoles were being phased out due to the fact that the Nintendo Switch was a highly popular home console or handheld device. And not to mention the fact that there are a ton of companies out there like Lenovo and Asus, all creating small handheld PC computers that are so powerful, they really blow my mind. They're insane. What an age we live in. And that, my friends, are the console generations in a nutshell. The Nintendo 64 console surprised the hell out of me. I always thought it was a 64-bit console, partially due to the name. Never expected it to be a 32-bit machine. That's the secret shame I've had for the last 28 years. Well, that's it for this episode. I'm going to look into another mystery from my childhood. I'm not going to spoil it, but it has something to do with this. Thanks for watching.